The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome, everyone.
Before we get into tonight's stories, we have a bit of paranormal news to share this week. On August 20th, the Economic Times published an article about a haunted doll in South Yorkshire, England. The doll, dressed like a Victorian bride, is housed in the Haunted Objects Museum in Rotherham, and it has caused quite a stir. Allegedly haunted by a vengeful bride named Elizabeth, or at least that's what they call her, she's attacked 17 men so far. A man named Lee Steer acquired the doll from eBay and added it to the museum collection, and then suffered the consequences. Apparently, he felt a burning sensation on his neck after being in the room with the doll and discovered scratches on his back, which witnesses said were in the shape of a pentagram. But that's not all. Elizabeth, according to Steer, has triggered the museum fire alarm, moved objects within the showroom, flung a perfume bottle across the room on camera, and caused all kinds of electrical problems in video footage. The New York Post reported that Steer's colleague and paranormal investigator John Paul Kenny had his own encounter with Elizabeth. While filming a TikTok video, he felt a tug on the back of his shirt, as if someone grabbed him, and then for the rest of the evening, he said that he kept seeing the image of a woman in a bridal gown out of the corner of his eye. As for the other 15 men who were allegedly attacked by Elizabeth, the articles don't offer any details other than saying that all the men reported being scratched while in the room with the bride doll.
That's interesting. And, it's actually a really pretty doll. It reminds me of the Gibson doll that we have in the spare bedroom. It's similar. She's very, very pretty. But I'm wondering how or why they settled on Elizabeth, why they decided to call her that name.
Yeah, I wondered that also. And I thought perhaps maybe they used that name because it seemed appropriate for the doll and for the time period. And I guess since he bought the doll on eBay, there probably isn't any way to ever figure it out, who originally owned it or why it supposedly has an attachment to it.
Yeah, that's true. You'd think with all the stuff that we've brought home from thrift stores and antique stores that we'd have issues with at least one haunted object, but I'm kind of glad that we don't.
Yeah, I don't think we need any other spirits moving in. I mean, we already have the ones that came with the house, and I think that's enough.
I agree.
So with that little bit of paranormal news out of the way, we have a pretty long episode planned for tonight. So, Beth, why don't you tell everybody where your mind wandered for this episode?
So tonight I'm going to be talking about 2 American castles in the Thousand Islands region of New York. But really quickly, just to give you an idea of where the Thousand Islands are, they stretch from northern New York to Ontario, from Lake Ontario and along the St. Lawrence River, from Prescott, Ontario to Henderson Harbor, New York. And although they're called the Thousand Islands, there's actually 1,864 of them. And in order to be an island included in that region, it has to stay completely above water 365 days a year, and it also must support one living tree, which I think is kind of cool.
That's quite the criteria.
Yes. So, as the mist rolls over the land to meet the castle walls, and the trees are shrouded in an eerie veil, the lone trespasser happens to look up and see the ghostly figure of a lady in white gliding across the ground, her face filled with sadness. It's a classic ghost image, right? The lady in white. But when it comes to Boldt Castle on Hart Island in Alexandria Bay, New York, that's exactly what visitors and volunteers claim to see. It kind of makes sense to have such a classic ghost tied to such a classic, tragic love story, because that's what Boldt Castle has come to represent, a romantic but tragic story. So, for the first half of my story tonight, I decided to look deeper into the history of Boldt Castle and why people believe that Louise Boldt is the lady in white that they claim to see. George C. Boldt was born in Germany in 1851. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1864, landing a job as a dishwasher in New York City. By age 25, he had impressed William Carer, the steward of the renowned Philadelphia Club. So he moved to Philly, where he managed the dining room. It was there that he met and fell in love with Louise Carer, William's daughter. Louise was 12 years younger than George, which isn't a huge age difference, but the two married on June 14, 1877, when she was 15 and he was 26. George and Louise quickly became what we'd call a power couple today, opening their own hotel, the Bellevue, in 1881. Next, George purchased the Stratford on the opposite corner. The couple's success caught the eye of William Waldorf Astor, and he hired George as the proprietor of his new hotel, the Waldorf. And so, George moved back to New York City, bringing his young wife with him. Louise was no shrinking violet, and she pretty much worked as George's equal, cleaning rooms and making sure that things ran smoothly. When John Jacob Astor, William's cousin, built his Astoria Hotel literally right next door to the Waldorf, George found himself thrown into the role of mediator between the millionaire cousins. He was so successful that he was able to merge the two grand hotels into one, the Waldorf Astoria. At this point, George was incredibly wealthy, and he bought the Waldorf Astoria Cigar Company as well. And the Waldorf Astoria Hotel became the best place to buy top-notch Cuban cigars. But George was also ahead of his time, convincing the hotel chef to put Thousand Island dressing on the hotel menu, where it became a tremendous hit with the wealthy patrons. He basically invented room service, and he insisted that hotels should offer fine dining with menu items like the Waldorf salad. For those of you who have heard of a Waldorf salad, but you may not know what's so special about it, it's basically a mayonnaise-based salad filled with celery, apples, grapes, and walnuts, and it's served on a bed of lettuce, and it's delicious. Louise, as I had said, was incredibly instrumental in the hotel's success. Her keen eye for decorating and understanding that hotels were for women just as much as for men resulted in fresh flowers in every room and dishes of candy on every table. She also insisted that a pin cushion be set out on every dresser in every room, so that a woman had somewhere to put her hat pins safely. She took a major role in decorating the dining rooms and ballrooms, balancing the aesthetic to please both men and women. In 1902, George had also built the largest hotel in Philadelphia, on the site of his former hotel, the Stratford, which he called the Bellevue Stratford. It had over 1,000 rooms and was the lap of luxury. Today, it's a Hyatt. The Boldt family summered in the Thousand Islands of New York, hence the reason he promoted Thousand Island dressing at the Waldorf Astoria. And in the year 1900, he decided that Louise deserved a home to rival all homes. He would build her a castle. The couple purchased Hart Island in the Thousand Islands region of New York, named after Senator E.K. Hart, spelled H-A-R-T, for $10,000. And ever the romantic, George had it reshaped to actually resemble a heart, renaming it Hart Island with an E-A, according to 19thCenturyGhosts.com. Modeling the castle after the ones from his homeland, the home would be 6 stories tall, approximately 60,000 square feet, and contain 127 rooms. The BoldtCastle.com official website says that George hired 300 stonemasons, carpenters, and artists to complete the castle, which included tunnels, a powerhouse, a yacht house, Italian gardens, a drawbridge, an Ulster Tower, or a children's playhouse, and a dovecote. The playhouse was large enough to contain a bowling alley, a billiard room, a library, and a kitchen. Although some sites say the castle was intended as a Valentine's Day present to Louise, others say it was an anniversary present. But either way, George was building the castle for Louise and their 2 children as a colossal monument of his love. Since construction was moving swiftly, it should be completed by the summer of 1904. But, like many people during that time, Louise contracted consumption, or tuberculosis, sometime in 1902. She passed away on January 7, 1904, at the age of 42. Completely bereft and heartbroken, George ordered that all construction on the castle should stop. According to USBoatTours.com, George did continue to visit the Thousand Islands, choosing to stay at his farm on Wellesley Island, but he never stepped foot on Hart Island again. He passed away in 1916 at his suite in the Waldorf Astoria, and his children, George Jr. and Clover, inherited the unfinished castle. Clover wanted to do something with the unfinished castle, which had sat untouched for 12 years. She partnered with Edward J. Noble, the man who founded the American Broadcasting Company, or ABC, and who also owned Lifesavers Candy, to try and do something. But after a deal fell through, she ended up selling her half of the island to Noble. Noble allowed tourists to visit the island for many years without putting any money into its upkeep. These visitors often vandalized the walls by tagging them or even chipping off pieces to bring home with them. Local teenagers flocked to the island for their own private parties. And the weather took its toll as well, eventually flooding most of the lower floors. For nearly 75 years, the castle just sat there, crumbling. But in 1977, the Thousand Islands Bridge Authority acquired the property from Noble, and ever since, they have poured millions of dollars into restoring it. The grounds are dotted with heart-shaped flower beds, and the first and second stories of the castle have been meticulously restored. Visitors can see the ballroom, parlor, dining room, kitchen, butler's pantry, and bedrooms. With each passing year, another room is revitalized, adding on to what is safe for people to see. But ever since just a few months after Louise passed away, many visitors have claimed to see her spirit clad in a white dress wandering Hart Island. Interestingly, she is never spotted inside the castle, though. Most people who have claimed to have seen her claim that she walks along the water's edge. Inside the castle, volunteers and workmen have reported the sound of phantom footsteps walking over their heads. But as of yet, no one has claimed to see any apparitions inside the house. However, some speculate that as the renovations continue, Louise has become more comfortable and more interested in what's going on inside the house she never saw finished. Since the Bridge Authority took over the property, they've employed a nighttime security guard to patrol the island. There are also several mentions of strange lights flashing from inside the castle at night when no one else is there. Could it possibly be Louise moving from room to room? Maybe. But the Thousand Islands isn't home to just one castle. Just 26 miles away in Chippewa Bay lies Dark Island and Singer Castle. Constructed at the exact same time as Boldt Castle, Singer Castle isn't known to be haunted, unless you believe the silly tale that former President George Bush Sr. haunts an upstairs closet. But it is known for having some very strange architectural details that to this day no one can fully figure out. Singer Castle was built out of granite, and luckily for the workers who were laid off because George Boldt stopped work on his castle, there was plenty to do at the Singer site, including hauling the granite over the ice and water from another nearby island and spreading out the 2,000 loads of topsoil brought from Canada to cover the 7-acre island. Singer Castle, when it was completed in 1905, included every type of room you could imagine, from a great hall that looks like it's straight out of medieval Europe, with a massive marble fireplace and 2 suits of armor standing on either side, to drawing rooms, a formal dining room with multiple buttons under the table for summoning the servants, the wine cellar, the breakfast room with arched windows, a kitchen, walnut-paneled library, and several bedrooms. Originally called the Towers due to its matching 47-story-tall granite towers, it also has a third tower, reaching just 5 stories tall, with a solid gold clock face on its front. In addition, the property also had a squash court, a rose garden, a 2-story ice house, and 3 boat houses, one of which was big enough to house a 120-foot yacht. So, who was wealthy enough to build the castle for $500,000 in 1902? I'll give you a hint. The castle is filled with antique Singer sewing machines. According to HistoricMysteries.com, Frederick Gilbert Bourne began working in New York City at the age of 14 when his father passed away. A hard worker who also enjoyed singing, Bourne met Alfred Corning Clark at the Mendelssohn Glee Club. Clark's father was Edward Cabot Clark, business partner to Isaac Merritt Singer. Together, they owned several real estate ventures and the Singer Sewing Company. At first, Bourne was brought into the real estate side of things, and as he showed his merit, Clark hired him to be the construction manager on a new project, the Dakota Building. Now, the Dakota might just be the most famous apartment building in all of New York City. Celebrities like Judy Garland, Lauren Bacall, Rosemary Clooney, and Boris Karloff once lived there. But you may know the name due to the tragic death of John Lennon, because he lived at the Dakota as well. Anyway, Clark was a very busy man, and he often sent Bourne to the Singer Sewing Company board meetings in his place. Eventually, Bourne worked his way to secretary of the company in 1885. By 1889, at the young age of 36, Bourne became the company's 5th president. Bourne and his family lived in the Dakota, and they also owned a 101-room mansion on Long Island, along with 1,000 acres. But Bourne decided that he, his wife Emma, and their 9 children needed a summer home, somewhere they could call their, quote, island hunting retreat, end quote. And so, for $5,000, Bourne purchased Dark Island in 1902, and for about $13 million in today's money, he built his castle. Well, he didn't build it. He hired architect and friend Ernest Flagg to design it. Flagg was already pretty well known for designing several landmark buildings, like St. Luke's Hospital, and a handful of the buildings at the U.S. Naval Academy in Maryland. Then Bourne hired Italian stonemasons to build it. It was completed in 1905, and by all accounts, the Bourne family spent many happy years there. So like I said, there aren't any ghost stories tied to the Singer Castle, but there are some other strange things, like secret passageways, tunnels, dungeons, grates for spying through, and trapdoors. Some of these secret passageways and tunnels can reasonably be explained, and I'll get more into detail about all of them in a second. But then there are the handful of them that really don't make much sense at all. So first, the secret passageways and tunnels. In the library, there was a specific book on the shelves that, when pulled, triggered a mechanism that unlocked one of the walnut wall panels. It was like Scooby-Doo. It revealed a passageway that led directly to the wine cellar. Another wall panel next to the fireplace opened into another secret passage. Then there is the tunnel that connects the kitchen to the dining room. Now, apparently, these types of passageways and tunnels were common in large houses at the time that employed a lot of servants, because then they could travel through the house much more quickly, appearing in rooms whenever a button was pressed in the floor to summon them. And this makes sense when you look at which rooms were connected this way: the kitchen to the dining room and the library to the wine cellar. A little more creepy, but also kind of explainable, are the spying grates, which were hidden all over the house. One is in the drawing room. One of the paintings on the wall can be tipped forwards and backwards so that whoever is standing in the secret passageway behind it can look into the room to see what guests might need without entering the room. It seems kind of creepy, but in a lot of ways it was practical when you wanted to impress your guests with how attentive your servants were to their drinking and dining needs. I'm sure these passageways were used all the time for other things, like listening in on conversations. I mean, how could they not have been? But at least they're explainable.
Or voyeurism.
I know. I was thinking it's like the Scooby-Doo house, and you look up and the eyes in the painting are moving.
It's actually pretty cool.
It's really cool. But then there are the trapdoors. And according to historicmysteries.com, staff at the Singer Castle are still discovering trapdoors to this day. Like the coat hook in Bourne's closet. When it's pulled, it triggers a trap door in the floor of the maids' quarters. Historians believe the Bourne family used this secret compartment to hide their valuables while they were away from the house. No one breaking into the house would check the maid's room for things worth stealing. However, the trap door in one of the towers that lead directly down into a dungeon is a little harder to explain. Bourne used that particular tower as his office, and why there is a dungeon and a hidden trapdoor leading down into it still can't be explained.
Well, perhaps the maid didn't do her job very well.
Yeah, but it's in his office in one of the towers. It's beneath his office. And why would you need a dungeon under your office?
A little bit of playfulness?
I guess. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could insinuate or assume, but...
We'll leave that to our listeners to imagine.
Historians tend to think that when Ernest Flagg designed Singer Castle, he based it on the castle from Sir Walter Scott's book, Woodstock or the Cavalier, a tale of the year 1651, which was about Charles II in Scotland. So many historians think that the dungeon and the secret passageways that don't seem to cater to servants and some of the other oddities are simply due to Flagg's love for this book. He basically wanted to build his own version of the castle from the book, which was also filled with all of those things, the secret passageways and the paintings you could spy through and things like that.
Right, and that's what I was kind of thinking to myself while I was sitting here listening to your story, is the fact that it does sound like if you're going to build a castle, you'd want all these cool things incorporated into it.
Right.
Whether they're used or not. It's just something that's fanciful.
Right, and they had 9 children. So there's also the belief that perhaps he had all those things added into the castle because it would...
Entertain them?
Entertain his children.
Yes.
Right? And maybe he got a kick out of it too. Maybe he also thought it was cool.
Well, who wouldn't?
Right. And tourists certainly get a kick out of all of the dungeons and secret passageways, speculating over what some of them were used for.
Just like we're doing.
Right. And so, all you wanderers, there you have it. 2 American castles in the Thousand Islands, both very much worth visiting, and both with some mysteries yet to be solved.
And the cool thing about that is you can actually go see them.
Both of them, yes. Yeah, they're not that far from here in either direction.
No,
just
not
have
at all.
to get in the car and go.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, very cool.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll return right after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? Bram Stoker may have been inspired to write Dracula not just because of Vlad the Impaler, but because of some bad seafood. He said that he dreamt of a vampire rising from his tomb after a helping of dressed crab at supper. Stoker began writing Dracula just 2 years after Jack the Ripper terrorized London. Dracula, the character, may have been based on Stoker's boss, Henry Irving. When Irving saw a performance of the story, he called it, quote, dreadful. Lucy Westenra's stake to the heart may have been inspired by the exhumation of Elizabeth Siddal. Her husband, Dante Gabriele Rossetti, had her buried with a copy of his poems entwined in her red hair. Several years later, when he wanted the poems back, he had her body exhumed. When Stoker submitted Dracula for publication, his editor wrote one word across the top: no. In the 1980s, Stoker's original manuscript was discovered in a Pennsylvania barn. It began on page 102, which means the beginning of Dracula isn't really the beginning at all, and the first 101 pages are completely lost to history. Who'da thunk it? All right, we are back. And where did your mind wander to?
Well, for my story tonight, I'm talking about something that back in the 1800s, people were quite fearful of and for good reason. In the winter of 1818, the people of Chebacco Parish in Massachusetts were deeply concerned. For months, they had noticed strange lights bobbing within the old burying ground. Whether it was ghosts or ghouls, they couldn't say for sure, but something was sneaking around throughout the graveyard at night. The never-ending snowstorms meant that the ground was constantly covered in new-fallen snow, and despite looking, no footprints of any kind were ever discovered. But according to NewEnglandHistoricalSociety.com, when the snow melted in April, the people found a random hair ornament on the ground. Wondering where it could have came from, the townsfolk were terrified when the family of 26-year-old Sally Andrews said that they recognized it. It was hers, and Sally, who had died of consumption, had been buried with it in her hair on Christmas Day of 1817. When they went to Sally's grave, it was empty. When the townsfolk searched further, they made a grisly discovery. According to historicipswich.net, at least 8 or more of their loved ones' graves were completely empty. 2 of them were just young boys, 10-year-olds Isaac Allen and Philip Harlow. Both of the children had passed away in October of 1817. But there were also the missing bodies of Samuel Burnham, age 26, 35-year-old Mary Millette, 79-year-old William Burnham, and 65-year-old Elijah Story. A 9th body was also taken, but his name has been lost to history. The parish committee gave the townsfolk permission to line up 8 of the empty coffins for everyone to see. They left them there for 3 months before they were reinterred right inside the cemetery gate, under what is now the hearse house. Body snatching was not uncommon during this time. Used in medical schools all over the country for dissection and other medical studies, corpses were highly sought after, and until 1815, it wasn't technically against the law to steal them. Body snatchers used all kinds of tricks to get their hands on the recently deceased bodies, from sending women into poorhouses claiming to be the relative of anyone who was recently deceased, to going into graveyards during the warmer months and literally digging them up. The people of Chebacco were understandably enraged, and they raised a $500 reward, about $12,000 in today's money, in hopes of catching the body snatcher of Chebacco for his, quote, most daring and sacrilegious robbery. One of the townsfolk, Dr. Thomas Sewell, had been practicing medicine in Ipswich, Massachusetts, for quite a while. He had tended to the people of Chebacco Parish ever since graduating from Harvard Medical School in 1812. Dr. Sewell was incredibly well respected, and by 1820 he had moved to Washington, D.C. Between 1821 and 1834, he was hired as a professor of anatomy and physiology at Columbian College, where he obtained a degree in religion and joined the Methodist Episcopal Church. And he was also the manager of the American Colonization Society. Basically, the American Colonization Society encouraged free black men and women to move to Africa. It was their racist way of discouraging free black people from helping other people escape from slavery. By May of 1841, Dr. Sewell was appointed the inspector of the penitentiary in Washington, D.C. by President John Tyler. Today, Dr. Thomas Sewell is remembered not for his racist society membership, but for 8 graphic drawings that he did of, quote, alcohol-diseased stomachs. Since he was also a firm believer in temperance, his highly detailed and graphic drawings caught the eye of temperance leader Edward Delavan, who made copies of the colored lithographs and sent them to every single household in the entire state of New York. He also made an additional 150,000 copies and sent them to poorhouses, prisons, hospitals, and schools according to alcoholproblemsandsolutions.org. Sewell believed very strongly in phrenology, the idea that a person's head shape and size is directly related to their intelligence and personality traits. But a third thing Dr. Thomas Sewell is remembered for is that he was the body snatcher of Chebacco. Now, what I didn't mention earlier is that Dr. Sewell had to leave Massachusetts back in 1820, and he chose to move to Washington, D.C., as a way to escape his past and his conviction. Although there aren't any details about how he was caught, there is mention in the sites that I looked at that Dr. Sewell was a prime suspect from the very beginning, simply because he gave anatomy lectures all the time to medical students, and people knew that he had to be getting the bodies from somewhere. When authorities entered his home, they were quickly able to find several body parts, all of which belonged to Sally Andrews and William Burnham. Dr. Sewell was able to hire Daniel Webster as his lawyer. Throughout his career, Daniel Webster was one of the most prominent lawyers in the United States. He served as Secretary of State under 3 presidents, Harrison, Tyler, and Fillmore, and he argued over 200 court cases in the Supreme Court. At the time that Dr. Sewell had hired him, Webster had already tried Supreme Court cases, and he was also a congressman. To give you a little idea about what kind of guy he was, in May of 1851, when the New York and Erie Railroad was completed, President Fillmore asked several members of his cabinet to be at the opening ceremony. The men got on board and rode the train for 2 days. Webster reportedly sat in a rocking chair that was attached to a flat car, covered in a steamer rug and clutching a jug of Medford rum. Each time the train stopped, he'd get off the train and deliver speeches to people waiting at each station, or, I would imagine, to anyone who would listen to him. But since he won nearly half of the cases that he argued in court, he was a pretty good lawyer. But as good as he was, he didn't win Dr. Sewell's case. In the end, Dr. Sewell was not convicted of taking the bodies from Chebacco Parish, but he was found guilty on 2 counts of, quote, knowingly and willfully receiving, concealing, and disposing of the bodies of 2 of his patients. The doctor was sentenced to pay a fine of $800. That's about $16,300 in today's money, to the families of Chebacco Parish, and to pay the prosecutor, William Andrews Jr., $250 for his expenses. On top of that, he was ordered to leave the Chebacco Parish and Ipswich communities. So, to backtrack a little, when Dr. Sewell moved to Washington, D.C., it was because Daniel Webster invited him there. And just 6 years later, he co-founded the medical department at Columbian College, now known as George Washington University. For over 200 years, people have argued over Dr. Sewell. Was he a medical pioneer who made great strides in understanding the effects of alcoholism, or was he a criminal with racist leanings who stole the bodies of loved ones from the community he was there to protect and care for? Some people like to point out that what goes around comes around, and perhaps Dr. Sewell got what he deserved. Remember Sally Andrews, Dr. Sewell's first victim who died of consumption? Well, Dr. Sewell died in 1845, at the age of 58, of tuberculosis, otherwise known as consumption. Perhaps fate intervened after all. Body-Snatchers didn't just steal bodies for medical research, they also stole them as ransom. And that's why former President Abraham Lincoln's body was moved 17 times, and his coffin opened 5 times, before he was finally laid to rest inside a steel cage filled in completely with a layer of concrete 10 feet high. In 1876, 11 years after Lincoln's death, counterfeiter Benjamin Boyd was arrested for engraving fake money plates and sentenced to 10 years in Joliet prison. But Boyd just happened to work for James Big Jim Keneally, a Chicago kingpin. Big Jim was a little peeved that his counterfeiting business had gone bust. Big Jim decided that not only would he get Boyd pardoned, but he'd also get back the $200,000 that he felt he was owed for his lost revenue. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about $4.6 million in today's money. So, according to the HistoryReader.com and National Park Service website, Big Jim hired two petty Chicago criminals, bartender Terrence Mullen and Jack Hughes, to go to Springfield, Illinois, and snatch Lincoln's body from his grave. All they had to do was break into his tomb, load Lincoln into a wagon, and get him to the shores of Lake Michigan. Then Boyd would tell the authorities he knew where the missing president was, demand the pardon and $200,000, and Big Jim would call it even. But Big Jim was a little worried that Mullen and Hughes wouldn't be able to pull it off, so he hired two more men, Louis Swiegels and Bill Neely. Neely would drive the wagon, and Swiegels, who claimed to be the best body snatcher known to man, would make sure it all went off without a hitch. On November 6, 1876, the four men boarded a train bound for Springfield, and just 2 nights later, they gathered outside Lincoln's tomb. They knew it would be padlocked, but since none of them knew how to pick a lock, not even Swiegels, the self-proclaimed best body snatcher around, they simply just filed the lock off. That's when the 500-pound mahogany and lead-lined outer coffin had them momentarily stumped. Eventually, by working together, they were able to remove most of it, and Swiegels ran off to get the wagon as the other 3 men lifted out the inner cedar casket containing the former president. Suddenly, the cemetery was swarmed with Pinkerton agents and members of the newly formed Secret Service. It turns out Swiegels and Neely were both undercover agents and had been letting the authorities know the group's every move. They had learned about the body-snatching heist early on, and after consulting with Robert Lincoln, the president's son, it was decided that the Secret Service and the Pinkertons would work together to bring down the criminals. One of the Secret Servicemen, feeling a bit jumpy in the dark graveyard, fired his gun at what he thought were body snatchers. It wasn't. It was actually Pinkerton agents, and in the chaos, the Pinkertons fired back. During the total confusion, as the Secret Service and Pinkertons fired at each other, Mullen and Hughes ran off. They made it all the way back to Chicago, and they hid out for 10 days before being caught in the Hub, a South Side saloon. Now, the irony is that the 2 men met Swiegels in the Hub to tell them all about their plan. So, they weren't the brightest criminals. Now, body snatching may have been illegal in Massachusetts in 1819, but it wasn't illegal yet in 1876 Illinois. Both men were simply convicted of attempting to steal a coffin, valued at $75, and sentenced to 1 year in state prison. Just like Dr. Sewell, their penalty wasn't very harsh either. Luckily, legislation was put in place that made grave robbing and body snatching illegal across the country.
I'm pretty sure that the Secret Service was created because of Lincoln's assassination. So it's interesting that a decade or so later they were working with the Pinkertons to try to catch these guys.
Yes, I would imagine so. And, it does happen when you have 2 different law enforcement agencies to sometimes not communicate between each other, and you could see where one may have not known the other was there. And in the confusion, they exchanged gunfire between the 2.
Right. But I also think it's funny that those 2 guys went back to the saloon where they had initially told the undercover agent about the plan. So why, I mean, to go back to where basically the scene of the crime where it all started, doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No, like I think we stated before, they were not the brightest individuals.
Right.
But it's a good thing that they weren't.
Right.
Because they would have got away with it probably.
Right. Yeah.
So, you got to say something for stupid criminals. They get caught.
Right. Well, everybody, as always, if you would like to know more about Boldt Castle or Singer Castle or about the Chebacco Body-Snatcher or the attempt to snatch Lincoln's body, you can always check our sources in our show notes.
That's right, you can.
Mm-hmm.
They're always there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. And join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.